All right, welcome back to the program. Associate Professor Dr. Franklin Ngwu at the Lagos Business School is joining me right now from Lagos. Dr. Ngwu, how are you? Good morning.
Good morning, Nancy. Good morning, Nigerians. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Let's get started because we have a lot to talk about. Still on budget 2022, since the president signed it on the last day of 2021, it's been generating a lot of issues. But I will start by asking you to really tell Nigerians briefly why they should be interested in the budget. Why should they be interested in 2022 budget?
So many things. There are so many. The federal government budget drives almost everything in the economy. And of course, the budget gives us a clear understanding of the expenditure, of the revenue of the government. And it also tells us the priorities that the government will focus on in a given year. And given the fact that it's also, will I say, almost the last budget of the present administration, Nigeria should be interested. And given also the fact that we are in a challenging, more or less challenging times, poverty is there, inequality is there, unemployment, infrastructure challenges, insecurity. So Nigerians are interested in terms of how will the federal government deal with some of these challenges that we're having. And of course, it's not only the federal government, we also have the state government, we also have the local government. So Nigerians are interested to see how these 3 tiers of government will address some of the critical challenges facing Nigerians.
The- Are you saying that Nigerians should get interested or Nigerians are interested? Because Nigerians will really say it's same old, same old. It's a ritual. How has my life gotten better, really? I haven't seen any significant change. For 2021, the budget was 13 trillion or so. Yes, about 13 trillion naira, with most of it spent on works and housing, on transportation, defense, agriculture, and all of that. But yet, Nigerians will still say, I haven't really seen any improvement in my life. So why should you convince them that they should be interested, as in interested, in this budget?
Even though that we still have challenges, as I earlier mentioned, for regards to poverty, inequality, unemployment, and all that, but it doesn't mean that the federal government, the state governments are not doing anything to address some of these issues. They might not achieve the expectations of Nigerians, but they are also making efforts. So if you look at, you mentioned infrastructure, for example, if you travel, you can see an improvement in terms of our roads, in terms of some of the things that I'm trying to do. But of course, you should also take into consideration that we've had long-term decay in some of these issues in Nigeria. So even though they are trying, Nigeria should not dismiss budget and say it doesn't matter because there hasn't been very convincing uh, improvements in their lives in terms of insecurity, in terms of unemployment, in terms of poverty alleviation and all that. But budget tells us what they're going to do. Budget tells us how they're going to spend the money. And it will also enable the private sector in particular to know where the government is focusing on and how the government will also and how the private sector will come in to support the government. Remember also that the issues that we have in Nigeria, and the only way we can solve it is through partnership of the different stakeholders, particularly the federal government, which is the public sector, and then the private sector. So the budget provides that document, that opportunity for the private sector to also understand where the government is going and also to see areas how the private sector can participate. Other stakeholders like the civil society organization can also come in to say, government, you've not looked at it from this perspective, you've not seen it from this perspective. And there will also be monitoring. There will also be feedback. There will also be a kind of involvement of the different stakeholders to say we are not getting it. For instance, if you remember, some years back, budgets are normally not passed in time. But of course, we've not gone back to January, December cycle. So, which means there is some kind of improvement. If you also look at the budget as well, you can also see that there's a kind of more attention to some of the priority areas of the country. So it is. I will definitely encourage Nigerians not to lose hope. I will also encourage them to have good hope and participation in this budget because it is our budget. It is not the federal government. It's not really technically the federal government budget. It's called Nigerians 2022 budget. So all of us are involved. All of us need to get involved, and we'll be asking questions in terms of monitoring, in terms of ensuring that this budget is they are fully implemented.
Now, before we go into the 2022 budget, let's take it from where we're coming from, 2021. How do you think that we fared in terms of budget, overall budget implementation and capital budget implementation? Because they are different things, overall budget implementation and the capital expenditure side implementation. And how did we fund the 2021 budget before we go into the 2022 budget proper?
Of course, even 2020 and 2019, there are two major issues. One is the budget formulation in terms of preparing the budget. The second thing is the execution or the implementation of the budget. It is a fact that we've not done well or we've not been doing well with regards to budget execution in terms of the percentage of execution that we've achieved. So it is in that note that Nigeria might say, okay, this is like a ritual that happens on yearly basis. But what I'm trying to say is that even if you look at 2021 budget, we had and how it was financed. We have been having deficits in terms of course, the budget are normally funded through borrowing, which many people have been saying that the rates at which we are borrowing is becoming a bit worrisome and excessive. But there is a challenge that we need to look into in terms of how will the federal government moving forward, because of course, if you keep borrowing, it's not sustainable. It's not something that we can maintain. The question then is, how do we critically improve the revenue of the federal government so that the revenues can now be used to reduce the deficits, so they can also be used to address some of these critical issues in the budget.
Okay, what would you say is the significant difference between 2021 budget and 2022 budget? I know in nominal terms, beyond the nominal terms, 2021 budget was about 13 trillion naira, a little bit above 13 trillion naira. 2022 budget, the president signed on December 31, 2021, a 17 trillion naira budget. This is the first time in history, in nominal terms, we've seen that size of budget. But what really is the significant difference between this year's budget and last year's budget?
Things you can see the differences. One is that recurrent expenditure seems to be increasing, which is not very, very good actually. Secondly, the capital expenditure is not increasing the way it's supposed to increase. I think it's just about 2%. So it's a challenge. So in terms of the deficit, it seems to be, it hasn't really increased, or it has reduced marginally. So these are the differences in the 2021 budget and 2022 budget. And also in terms of the the price of oil. So it's also a difference. But in terms of the key areas, capital expenditure, recurrent expenditure, statutory transfers, oil price, and other factors, there are differences. But of course, some of them have increased, some of them reduced. So it depends on how you look at it. So if I focus on recurrent expenditure, for example, it's clear that the way our recurrent expenditure is going up is not the way to go. In the sense that what we're supposed to be focusing on is supposed to be capital expenditure. But if you look at the current expenditure, it's taking almost 6 point something trillion. While what we are supposed to see is that the capital expenditure is supposed to be taking a lot more than the recurrent expenditure. So it's something that we need to rethink and see how can we improve to see that recurrent expenditure is going down, while capital expenditure should be going up. That is the way we're supposed to be. Particularly for a country like Nigeria, where we have serious infrastructural challenges, where we need that infrastructure to more or less properly jumpstart the economy, to enable the different sectors of the economy to start improving as well.
You know, doctor, oftentimes we fall into the trap of talking about numbers. You know, so many big numbers, very gigantic numbers. I think there's a cartoon for children called Gigantosaurus. You know, once you have children like this, you start being so familiar with a lot of things, that big animal. So oftentimes we fall into the trap of big numbers. But let's talk about substance now with this 2022 budget. What are the substances that Nigerians can really take away from these big numbers with papers all around?
I mean, some of the things that we can, if we look at these budgets, we also have more breakdown. So in 2022, we are looking at the current non-debt expenditure will be about 6.829 trillion, which will be used, as you know, in terms of paying salaries, maintaining the employees, and all that. Then debt service will be about 3.9 trillion. It's a big problem as well. Then capital expenditure will be about 4.891 trillion. And in terms of deficit, it's going to be about 6 trillion. So these are the breakdowns. So if we now compare it, as we said, let's look at the numbers. Then you now break it down into different sectors, ministries of the government in terms of works and housing, agriculture, telecommunications, and all that. But the important thing is to look at the growth drivers for 2022. One will be telecommunications, financial services, agriculture, transport, construction, and all that. So what we're supposed to be looking at is how do we ensure that these critical growth drivers are properly supported? And possibly they can now help us to bring up other sectors that are not growing the way they're supposed to grow. So in terms of breaking it down to numbers is to say, how do we ensure that some of the budget that we have will be properly, judiciously, prudently executed, so it will really help Nigerians to address some of their needs in terms of, like I said, poverty reduction, trade and commerce to improve, transportation, and all that. By the time that happens, what Nigerians are really looking at is not really about the figure. What Nigerians are looking at is in terms of, oh, my standard of living somehow has gone up. Inequality has gone down. Poverty has gone down. Unemployment has gone down. Maybe disposable income has gone up. And inflation has been curbed. Interest rate is now moderate that people can now borrow to do investment. So these are the real things that Nigerians are looking at. And the only way we can achieve it is in proper and judicious execution of the budget. So if you ask a layman on the road now and say, what do you think about this budget? All he's thinking about is how will he get more disposable income? How will he get electricity? How will he travel on the road without being kidnapped? How will he travel on good road? How will his farm produce be sold or properly stored and all that? So these are the areas that we're supposed to focus on.
You know, okay, still talking about the substances in this budget, just even beyond the numbers or what those numbers mean, let's take a look at the revenue challenges that we will have. The government has projected a revenue of 10 trillion naira, expenditure of 17 trillion naira. Deficit definitely is around 6 trillion naira. What kind of challenges do you think that the government would face along the way in terms of meeting this revenue? Bearing in mind that at least in the last few years, we've not met our revenue expectation. So is the government going to meet it this time, especially with the finance bill that has been attached to it? We have a 7.5% VAT. Are companies also going to be doing well this year to contribute more corporate income taxes? The issue about VAT is also by the corner, you know that. So we need to also put that into cognizance.
I mean, you raised very important issues, Nancy. I mean, clearly, 2021 budget, I think the revenue, if I remember, was about 8 trillion. This year, we are looking at about 10 trillion, 10.1. So it means that there's a deficit of about 6 trillion or 6 point something trillion. So, and of course, you know, it means that the government will really need think critically. One is, how do we even achieve this 10 point something trillion revenue? They cannot achieve it by ensuring that everybody that's supposed to pay the tax. It means that FIRS need to work around the clock to ensure that we get all the taxes that we're supposed to get to meet up with this revenue. It also means that they might need to rethink and expand on the basket of people paying taxes. So, of course, these are in terms of getting revenue from the government, tax is one of the key areas. So, if they don't do that, then there's a problem. But it also means that if that happens, it means that we have to maybe fall back on borrowing again. But what is even more important in the medium to long term is to see how we can diversify the revenue base of the government. If you look at present, we depend more on oil revenue. But that's not what it's supposed to be. So the question then is, how do we, which we've lost over these years, that we've not really critically and proactively expanded the revenue base of the government. So I think that's the focus, because each year we're going to be having deficits. And we're going to be borrowing. But the borrowing is not going to be sustainable. And if we are not able to meet up with our revenue, it means that we have to run into borrowing again, which is not right. So what we're supposed to be focusing on is, how do we ensure that the government expands the revenue base, not through taxes alone, but in terms of the productive capacity of the government, of the economy, to be able, particularly export goods and services, to earn more revenue, and even to sell more within Nigeria to earn more revenue with regards to taxes, as the case may be.
Doctor, do you think we really have a revenue challenge? And let me play the devil's advocate here, really. Is it a revenue challenge we have, or more of an expenditure challenge? I know analysts like you say, okay, perhaps we have a revenue challenge. We're borrowing so much. Our debt is huge, 38 trillion naira, which I'll come to in a bit. But do we also have an expenditure challenge? The money we have, what are we spending it on? Which pockets are those monies going into?
We have both a revenue challenge and expenditure challenge. But in all sincerity, our budget is small in terms of the population, in terms of the per head. So if we look at what we have and divide it by the population, it's quite small. So, and also when you look at the revenue that we are getting and look at the size of the country and the population of the country, is also very, very small. So that's the revenue challenge. But in terms of the expenditure, is also a challenge, which is a different matter altogether in terms of how do we rethink the governance structure that we have in Nigeria, vis-a-vis the way we share the money, the federal government, that is the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And then also come down to the states and local government. So that's a different discussion altogether, which is the expenditure issue. But also within that expenditure, you can also say, how do we rethink the allocations? As I mentioned earlier on, in terms of how do we keep increasing on our current expenditure, but our capital expenditure is not increasing the way it's supposed to increase. So that recurrent expenditure is also something that we need to rethink, which is also linked to what I said before in terms of the structure of governance that we have in Nigeria. Because of so many senators, ministers, all of them will have special assistants, all of them will have senior special assistants, and all that. And so it's quite a different issue. But the principal thing that we have in Nigeria is a revenue challenge. There is no way you can look at our major source of revenue, which is oil, and say this is adequate. So in terms of our per head, we have about 0.006 per head in Nigeria because of our oil production. But when you now compare it to other oil producing countries, you find that we're not doing enough. So when you have a budget of about 30 billion, and you have Saudi Arabia and Norway with lesser population that are doing about $170 billion dollars, and about $200 something billion dollars, you really know that we have a revenue challenge. So while I'm not dismissing that we don't have expenditure challenge, there is expenditure challenge, But a critical one is the revenue base of the government. It's quite small, it's quite limited. And that's why
Okay.
I'm emphasizing that the focus should be in terms of how do we mobilize both the private sector, the public sector, to see how we can increase the productive capacity of the economy, to see how we can start exporting, to see how we can reduce our import dependence, so that we can now have a viable economy to increase on our revenue.
Doctor, you said that the size of our budget right now is small, and you're not the first person that has said it, at least in my years of doing this. Many economists have told me, Nancy, the size of our budget is small. I just said earlier during the morning market brief, Ghana's budget, the equivalent in naira terms, is about 8.9 trillion naira. In fact, they're taking away 20% of the expenditure because they couldn't get away with the 1.75% e-levy that has been passed to the parliament by the executive. Ghana is a country of about, I don't think they're even up to 25 million people now. 8.9 trillion naira, as is 17 trillion naira. What do you think should be the size of our budgets if you're looking at it that all things being equal? That we're doing things right, our expenditure is nice, budget revenue, it's also okay. What do you think could really be the size of our budget if we're really doing things in a right way than we're doing right now?
I think it's a very interesting question, but remember also that we are looking at just the federal government budget. We also have 36 states in Nigeria with FCT, that is Abuja. We also have about 774 local governments. So when you bring all these people together, it means that our budget will, I mean, you can say it is not as small as I explained earlier on. But if we focus on federal government budget, given the powers that they control, given the sectors that they control, and given the things that they do, I think that we should be looking at a budget of over 50 trillion, at least to be able to reasonably address some of these challenges that we have. But what is even more important as well is how will we ensure that the state governments execute the budget that they normally say at the end of at the beginning of every year. Because most of the time Nigerians focus on the federal government, and we forget that each state in Nigeria, that there's no state that doesn't budget at least 100 billion that they're going to spend in a fiscal year. So the question is, if the federal government is implementing their own, why or how do we ensure that the state governments also judiciously implement their own? And also the local government also implement their own. I was talking to somebody, and he told me that local government in Enugu, my state, that some of them receive over 1 billion in a year. So the question, that means that local government receive over 100 million naira in a month. So the question then is, how do we ensure that these 3 tiers of government judiciously implement their budget? If they do it, you will see reasonable improvement in development, standard of living, unemployment will reduce, and all of them will reduce. But this focus on federal government is not appropriate, is not going to help us. It's something that we need to address. There will be more attention on the implementation of state and local government budgets.
Okay,
If Nigerians
Doctor, let me butt in
and
here.
examine and question what they are doing with state government, with state budgets, with local government budgets, I think we will achieve a better outcome. But it seems that we more or less ignore local government and state government, and the focus is normally on federal government.
Doctor, let me butt in here a bit, talking about the state government. And if we take a look at what the federal government as well as the state government are going to be doing this year, in terms of their budget estimates, both FG and states, the total of their budget are about 26.6 trillion naira. 26.6 trillion naira. So if you take away the federal government budget of about 17 trillion naira, you would see like a 9 trillion naira shared among the 36 states and FCT for 2022. Have it in mind also that Lagos State has the highest budget for this year and has always been having the highest budget, at least in recent times. of about 1.73 trillion naira. Now, where I'm going to really is that if you take a look at the states, just as you have mentioned, they've given us their budget estimate. How do you think that we can really scrutinize them more? Some of the states have more capex than recurrent expenditure. We've also seen that capex, which is capital expenditure, has risen at least in the last few years. But how can we begin to evaluate the states and also monitor them, that the 9 trillion naira that is dispersed amongst the 36 states and FCT is judiciously spent, monitored, and evaluated, and also get down to the grassroots, really?
Interestingly, last year, the capex was 34.24% of the total expenditure. For 2022, I'm talking about the federal government, it's going to be about 29.84% of total expenditure. Interestingly, I'm sure you know, we have the National Development Plan that was launched the other time. And interestingly as well, they had one state, one governor, the geopolitical zone, participating in that National Development Plan. And the 2022 federal government budget is going to drive or come from that National Development Plan. It means that each state government is supposed to execute his or her own budget in line with that National Development Plan, in respect to his or her own state priorities. So what we can do in terms of monitoring or even focusing on state government is that I think that the relevant stakeholders, particularly people like you, Nancy, the media, we are supposed to focus more on the state government. So a good example is Nancy will be focusing on South-South for 1 week. You'll be focusing on South-East for another week, North-Central for another week, and you go through the 6 geopolitical zones, focusing on specific state budget in terms of their implementation, in terms of their execution. We can do a 5-year analysis of each of these states and say, how have you implemented your budget? Interestingly, this is even the best time to do it because most of the state governors are preparing to hand over. Some of them are preparing to contest for presidency. Some of them are preparing to go into Senate. So this is the time to really question everyone to say, the money that we've given you over these years, what have you done with it? Give us your scorecard. So I'll be able to say, okay, you've done well, and that means you're qualified to aspire for something better. So I think that the media, I'm talking about television, newspapers, and all the other stakeholders, civil society organizations, all of them should come together and say, how do we focus more on state government? And let me also mention something. Because that we have federal allocation every month, most state governors are not thinking deeply and innovatively in terms of how they improve the revenue of their states. So they're depending on more on the allocation they get from the federal government. But if we focus more on them and start pointing out to them what they can do to improve their revenue of their states, it means that we actually help the Nigerians. So what I'm suggesting and advocating, that there should be more attention to state government and local government. And we should be able to identify the critical stakeholders in every state and to ask them, have you questioned your governor? Have you questioned your local government chairman in terms of what they've done with this budget? And we should be able to call from the governors and from the government to this kind of forum and ask them questions and say, what have you done with your budget? We've seen that in Sokoto State, this is what you've done. We've seen in Bayelsa State, this is what you've done. Do it in a different way. And by putting them on the spot, I believe that the governors and the government chairman can be able to improve in terms of what they are doing. But at the moment, imagine when a local government gets about 1 billion every year. And when you go throughout in our local government, you don't see anything at all. And we say, oh, it's the federal government or it's the state government. No, it means that if a local government, a typical example is a state that has about 18 local government or 20 local government, that means 20 billion in a year, and nobody accounts for it.
Okay.
We can't continue like that. A typical example is the Ngwu, where you have about 17 local government. That means about 17 billion. So we have to question and say, what have they done with this money? And what have they done with the state budgets as well?
Okay. Doctor, 3 minutes to the end of the program, and 3 minutes I'm going to bring in 3 questions for you to answer very quickly, and I'll start timing. I'll put on my timer right now. 3 minutes, Three questions. Let's take a look at the 2022 budget policy expectations. The fuel subsidy removal, we've seen the furore around the fuel subsidy removal. What do you think? How should government handle it? Labour is also kicking on one point. Other policy expectation, electricity tariffs to the Finance Act 2021 by the side. The second question is that of the fiscal fundamentals, and I will come around the oil price. Oil price, I think, for this budget has been put at $62, if I'm not mistaken, for 2022 budget, $62 with 1.8 million barrels per day. How realistic is that? You talked about Saudi Arabia earlier. Saudi Arabia is predicting a budget surplus for its country this year based on oil price as also the volume of oil that will be produced. Third question, U.S. inflation at 7%, expectations of interest rate hike this year by, what's his name, Jerome Powell. How do you think this will affect our debts? Very quickly, 3 minutes. I'm putting on my timer now.
I think that so many questions in 3 minutes. Well, let me just mention
You're an associate professor.
Most likely, America will increase the interest rates because they have to do that maybe to curb the inflation. And if they do that, it means that Europe and UK will follow suit to increase their interest rate as well. And if they do that, it means that capital flows to Nigeria and to other developing and emerging markets might decline because investors will prefer to move their money where in a safer climes and where you have a good interest rate as well. So it's going to affect us somehow, but it depends on what China does and what other rich developed and emerging markets do as well. So that's on that note. With regards to the issue of the oil price, I think that it's a good price. Even though oil price is a lot higher now, but it also gives us it's better to do it like that than to overshoot yourself and put it at a very high price. Supposing, of course, the oil price is dependent on so many factors, which most of them are not within our control in terms of the external volatility of the oil price. So it's something that we need to be cautious about. So I will say that putting it at that price is reasonable. If we get more as we get in now, the better for us. But if it doesn't, if we put it at a higher price and we don't get it, it now becomes more challenging. With regards to the issue of fuel subsidy, I think that removing the fuel subsidy, objectively, that's the right thing to do. However, it is the way you remove the subsidy that really matters. In the sense that how do we ensure that when the subsidy is removed, that the vulnerable groups in our society, the poor, are somehow taken care of to alleviate the consequences of removing the subsidy. The truth of the matter is that maintaining the subsidy is not sustainable in Nigeria, in the sense that what we are using to subsidize the oil price can actually be used to address some of the other critical challenges that we have, which will actually benefit the masses and the poor better than using it for the subsidy. But so what I'm trying to say is that subsidy should be removed, but the poor and the vulnerable of our society should be properly taken care of. We should have strategies to make sure that the impact of removing the subsidy is more or less reduced to a minimal level so that they would not be terribly affected. I think those are the three questions that you asked me, which I think I've answered in less than 3 minutes.
That's why you're an associate professor. You can't just be an associate professor like that. You've got to answer questions very quickly and, very well. Okay, I think we have 2 minutes or let's say a minute. What's your economic forecast for 2022? What's your economic forecast, really, for 2022? How are we going to look like? Or in the local balance, Shana, like this, we go the day. By December 2022, how are we going to look like? Will we be better? Should we have more money in our pocket? What opportunities are there in the 2022 budget that you can take advantage of, that I can take advantage of?
I think that we should be optimistic. 2022 will be better than 2021. Remember also, let me even start in an interesting note. It's more or less an election period. So politicians will bring out their money. They will engage with the stakeholders. They will engage with Nigerians. It means that they will spend money. And if they are spending money And it means that also it will trickle down to Nigerians. Also, if you look at the plan, there will be more FAC allocations increasingly from Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. It means also that there will be more disposable income to Nigerians. And if that happens, and they now execute the budget more, it means that Nigerians will be better off than what they had last year. Interestingly, again, the private sector is also going to participate more, particularly with the increasing use of technology, digitization, that is helping to address some of these challenges that we have in Nigeria, in Africa, and globally as well. So, for instance, we now have the payment systems that you can pay money to anybody, any part of the world, and we're also having the African one. Nigerian one is working very well. So with technology and other factors, I really think that the outlook for this year will be a lot better than what we achieved last year. Inflation will likely go up, but I believe that it will also moderate. But generally, Nigeria should be optimistic that this year will be a lot better than last year. Moreover, there are more Nigerians abroad, so we're going to have more remittances from Nigerians abroad as the economy of Western countries also continue to improve as well.
Thank you very much, Doctor. We don't have much time. I would have interrogated this last one of remittances further, but let's leave it for another day. Let's leave it for another day. Thank you very much for being a part of the show today. I wish you a lovely day. All right, I've been speaking with Dr. Franklin Ngwu, who is an associate professor at the Lagos Business School. We've been looking at the 2022 budget that the president signed on the 31st day of December 2021. That's so much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for being a part of the show today. Please join us again, same time next week, bright and early on Monday. I will be here, God willing. Be the best you can be and be that change that you want to see. I am Nancy Naji. Bye now.